Hello, everybody. It is your girl Simone Nicole here, back at it again for yet another video. And I cannot clap because today we have my tiny mic. And we have my tiny mic today because we're getting into a new series here on my channel. And that series is called Simone Watches. I don't know why I haven't started this yet because I have so many different opinions and feelings. I'm really excited for this video because today we're going to be talking about the movie Mone. Oh, baby. Let's talk about it. Let's also talk about the fact that I went to go rewatch this movie for, the purposes of this video, and I can't find it anywhere. And I posted about it, and one of my followers said that she believes that it was actually pulled from all theaters nationally because someone in the movie theater that she works in had a psychotic break watching it. So with that being said, let's give a couple trigger warning. Trigger warning for everything: sexual assault, misogyny, abuse, gaslighting, spoiler, childbirth. Yeah, we're gonna get into it. So I feel like I want to start this video out by going over the plot and then save my opinions for later on in the video. So if you have not watched this movie and do not want to know the spoilers for it, then don't watch this video because I'm going to explain the entire movie from start to finish. So let's do that. What are you doing now?
What are you?
So this movie has a cold open, which is pretty interesting. We see our main character, whose name is Harper, and she has a bloody nose and she's staring out her balcony, and we see a man literally falling from the sky, seemingly past her, making eye contact with her, and then presumably falling to his death. And then we cut to Harper driving down the highway, and immediately we know that we're in for a little bit of a treat. Well, Harper pulls up to this estate, and it's a beautiful estate. It's clearly in the middle of nowhere, so we are very clear in the fact that we are getting set up for some form of a horror movie where she is clearly the damsel in the middle of nowhere at this beautiful estate. And the first thing that she sees is an apple tree in the front yard, and it has fresh apples on it. And she walks up to it, she looks at the apples, and then she bites into the apple. As she's enjoying this fresh apple off of the apple tree, we see a man staring at her through the window in the estate that she is staying in. And we find out that that person that is staring at her is her, I'm gonna call him an Airbnb host because that's what I would call him in 2022. So she's on holiday, we find out, when she's talking to the Airbnb host, Jeffrey. And Jeffrey, I hate him. He makes my vagina clench real tight, but not for good reasons. And then he makes weird comments be careful what you flush as a lady. So he makes that comment, and then he makes an emphasis on saying Mrs. Aren't you a Mrs.? And she's like, huh?
Would it just be you staying, or
Excuse me?
Mrs. Mone?
No.
And he repeats he's like, well, where's your husband? And she's like, oh, I'm not married anymore. So she calls her friend. This person on the phone is presumably her best friend, and she's telling her about the estate and how much she loves it, and how this would just be such a good experience for her to get away. And she mentions that the Airbnb host brought up James. So we find out that James is actually her ex-partner. And then we are immediately placed into a flashback. This is where we officially get to meet the husband, James. And the conversation is going back and forth. He's like, so you want to divorce me? And she's like, yes, I can't do this anymore. You're not making me happy. And he's like, well, if you divorce me, I'll myself. What the fuck? And he's like, how are you going to feel that you're going to have my blood on your hands? Because if you divorce me, I have nothing to live for, and I'm going to kill myself. And literally Harper, the girl boss she is like, that has nothing to do with me. You will not manipulate me into staying with you by threatening to kill yourself. That's really up, and you will not put that on me. I am unhappy. I don't want to be with you anymore. I got to go. So we rewind, or I guess we fast forward to present day, and she's gotten settled into the Airbnb. And what does any protagonist decide to do in a horror movie that is a woman by herself? take a walk. And she ends up running into this cave-like structure, and it is so deep and so far back that she can't see through it. So she decides to start like making noises or like sounds to see how far her voice will echo in. And all of a sudden we see a figure all the way at the far end of the cave get up, walk to the middle of the cave, and then start to sprint towards her. And Harper turns around and like jogs away. So she makes her way out of the forest, and she finds herself in the middle of this field. And when she turns to look back behind her, there's like this abandoned house kind of a thing. And she's like, you know what? I'm tripping, let's just take this moment to like just relax, cool down. And she pulls out her phone to take a picture of it to send either to her friend or just for memory purposes. As she takes the picture, right, here's me, taking a picture. In the corner of the camera, she sees a naked man. Out. No, it wasn't blurred. Out. So she turns again and walks away. She walks away, and we jump into another flashback. In this flashback, we see Harper walking up on something, but the camera doesn't show us yet. Once we see what she sees, it's actually James's dead body. So that flashback, or that quick montage at the beginning of the film where someone was falling, it was James. It was indeed her husband, and she is looking at his body dead on the pavement. He has like a severely broken foot, and he's fallen on a fence, gashed his head open, and his hand is still stuck at the top in like one of the spikes of the fences. So he's actually ripped his hand down, like between his, like, let's say like your middle finger and your ring finger, like all the way down, tendons and everything. It was very, very graphic to see. So we fast forward, and Harper's in the bath. She's having herself a bath, and she sends the picture to her friend, and her friend's response is OMG. Okay. She just disregards it, I guess, and is like, funny story, ha 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 ha. And then we go to the next day. We flash forward to the next day, and Harper has sat down to work. So she's talking to a client on the phone, and the camera is focused in on her. But out of focus behind her, we see the naked man walking across the yard back behind her. Then her friend calls her, and she's like, okay, you didn't give me a grand tour of the place yesterday, like it's time for you to give me a tour. So she starts to walk her friend around the Airbnb, showing her everything, and the man is literally following her outside of the house, like from room to room. Harper, even though she's showing off the apartment, just simply never shows him, just never happens to catch his eye, I guess we're supposed to believe. And she is about to point the camera outside, and she looks up and she sees the naked man eating from the apple tree. She hangs up on her friend. She literally goes, gotta go, hangs up on her friend, and then is just staring at him. And he catches her staring at him through the window. He starts to walk toward the house. That's when she walks to the front of the house and discovers that the front door is open. But she goes towards the front door to close it. And in the nick of time, before he can kind of like shove it in at her and get into the house, she closes it. And she's also on the phone with 911 by this point. And he then sticks his hand through the mail slot. And next thing you see, the officers have him on the ground and are detaining him. Harper is talking to, now we notice that this is the only other woman besides her friend on the phone that we have seen this entire movie. Every other person has been, you guessed it, a man. And the woman is like, I think it's okay. Like, he really stinks. But besides that, he seems pretty harmless. He tried to break into your house completely naked, and he followed you home from the woods yesterday. But besides that, he seems completely harmless. So after the officers leave, she calls her best friend to tell her about what has transpired. And her friend is like, yo, like, you don't have to be there alone. Like, I can be there with you. And she's like, no, like, I came out here to get peace. I came out here to like get solace, and I won't let anybody run me out of this house or ruin this experience for me. We see her happen upon this very, very, the church kind of looks like a relic, kind of like it's pulled straight out of another time period. Like, it looks very well preserved. Harper is sitting in the pews, and we get another flashback. She's texting her friend, presumably the same friend that she's been talking to this entire time, about how she's scared of James and how she's scared of the situation. And James comes up from behind her, snatches the phone out of her hand, and is like, oh, so you're scared of me? Oh, I'm scared of you. And I'm like, he gets really upset and then ends up punching her dead in her face. So she gets up and she gets in his face and she is screaming at him and essentially saying, you will never see me again a day in life. Get the fuck out of my house. We flash back to the present. She's like screaming in the pews at the top of her lungs, like head between her legs, screaming in agony clearly. And the priest like pokes around the corner and then like backs away. And I'm like, bro, isn't this your job? Like, isn't this your job to console people, make people feel better? So she leaves the church, and as she's walking, this little boy is sitting on the steps outside of the church with a mask on, and it looks like a sex doll mask. It was very creepy. And then he takes off his mask, and this is the face, and he's so calm in asking her like, well, do you want to play a game of hide and seek? And she's like, no, you creepy little boy, I don't want to play a game of hide and seek. And he's like, why? You're being so mean to me. And it's like, well, she's a stranger, she doesn't owe you anything. And then out of nowhere, while she's going back and forth with this little boy, creepy pastor guy, yeah, he comes out and is like one step behind her, and he goes, oh, little Timmy, I don't know what the name is, oh, little Timmy, leave her alone. And he's like, I just want to play with her. And he's like, leave her alone. And then underneath his breath to the priest, he's like, you. And then when he's walking away from the two of them, he looks at her and calls her a stupid bitch. So then the pastor's like, you know what, I should have intervened earlier. I heard you struggling, you know, when you were inside of the church. And she was like, yeah, I have been struggling. So he was like, let's sit down and let's talk. Harper sits down to tell him the story of her and her husband. And she ends up filling in the gaps that we have as the audience in saying that she was told that after she pushed him out of the apartment and said, you would never see me again, that James actually fought his way into the apartment right above them so that he could go through their apartment to scale down to get onto their, James and Harper's apartment, in order to break in that way. So she was told that in the process of doing that, he slipped and fell. And that's where we get that opening scene of him falling. He didn't actually intend on himself, supposedly. He was trying to get down to their apartment so that he could force his way back in and hopefully talk himself back into Harper's life. And the priest is sitting there listening, and then all of a sudden he reaches over and grabs her thigh. He was already creepy to me, but now he's like extra creepy to me. And she was like, she's just shaking her head, like literally tears rolling down her face, like, yeah, like I am pretty consumed with guilt. And he was like, I mean, that's fair. You must feel really guilty because, like, you didn't even give him a chance to explain why he hit you. And she's like, huh? And he's like, I mean, men strike women sometimes. Like, it's not the nicest, but it's also not a capital offense. And she literally is like, okay, fuck you. And he's like, aghast. And she's like, you. And then she leaves, and he's like staring after her longingly, and then like disgustingly puts on like his little chapstick and then like licks his stupid little lips and then like feels on the seat where she was sitting. And I'm like, oh. Harper, after having a very long day, walks into a bar, and the Airbnb host is there, and she asks for a drink. It's like, oh no, I got you, your money's no good here. And she like insists on paying. Like, she's like, I'm fine, I can pay for myself. But the Airbnb host ends up paying for her. The cop walks in from the arrest earlier, not the female cop that she was talking to, but one of the male arresting officers. So the officer, instead of talking to Harper, looks at the Airbnb host and was like, oh, kind of crazy, like what happened at your property, as if it didn't happen to Harper herself. He was like, I mean, but it's all fine because he's out now. And she's like, excuse me? And he's like, I mean, what did you want us to hold him on? Like, he didn't do anything. And she's like, he stalked me. Like, he followed me home from one day to the next. I saw him twice. And his response was, well, you saw him twice, but we can't even prove that he saw you once. So she is pissed by this statement and ends up leaving the bar and storming out. And she begins her walk home. And that's when she starts to feel a little creeped out. So then she picks up the pace and she starts to run. As she's running, we notice in the background that who's back? Mr. Penis. She ends up calling her friend as soon as she gets in the door, and she's like, hey, like, I was wrong. I need help. I need you to be here. And the friend is like, oh yeah, how long is the drive? 4 hours? I'm gonna make it in 3. So she proceeds to sit down and actually try to give her the address. And every time she actually tries to give her the physical address, she can't get past the village, the name of the village, without the phone cutting out. And she's like, hey, just text me the address. So she sends her location, and then the response from her friend is, I already know where you are, stupid bitch. And then the lights cut. So she goes outside to the front, and the officer is standing underneath the apple tree, and she's literally asking him questions, and he's just not responding. Like, he's just staring at her. And all of a sudden, every single apple on the apple tree completely falls off. All the lights in the front yard go black. They come back up, and then a man is charging at her from across the yard. So she ends up getting back into the house in the nick of time, closing, slamming, locking the door. So she figures out that she's likely being watched. So she runs back into the house and she grabs a knife. There's a chair that, I don't know if it flies through the window or gets knocked over, unsure. But the point is that the chair moves forward and moves backwards. And Harper is screaming this entire time because someone is now in the house with her. But all of a sudden, all the noise stops. And she walks toward the front door because she hears someone trying to get into the door. The Airbnb host walks in. And she explains to him what happened. And she's like, someone was watching me. Someone's trying to get to me. And he ends up going into the kitchen and just finds a dead raven. And then says like, oh dear, it was just the dead raven. Like, it's nothing to be afraid of. And she's like, why would I make this shit up? I'm not making this up. He's like, I'm not saying you're making this up. You know what? Let me walk the grounds and figure out, what's going on. He gets across the yard. And what do you think happens? Blackout. Blackout, and then the lights rise to reveal naked man standing about 5 feet in front of her. She calmly walks back into the house, locks the door, and the naked guy sticks his hand through the mail slot, and he clearly wants to hold her hand. So she reaches out to grab his hand, and he grabs her hand so hard that it's almost like he's trying to like hurt her. So she takes the knife that she had and she stabs him through the hand. Now, a regular person would scream, do anything to make the pain stop. This man proceeds to slide his hand out with the knife still in it through the mailbox, cutting himself between his ring finger and his middle finger all the way down. And the knife drops to the floor. She then hears a dragging sound coming from the kitchen. She walks into the kitchen, and the little boy is standing in the kitchen because he had been dragging the sex doll mask across the counter back and forth. And he holds up his hand and he says, look what you did to me. And his hand too is split between his ring finger and his middle finger. He was the exact same person. Like, there's one actor playing every single one of these men in this movie. He again requests to play hide and seek with her. And when she refuses, again, literally knife up to his chest, he's like, you're so mean to me. Why are you so mean to me? They back out of the kitchen and she slams the door in his face. He says, you better kill me now because this is your last chance. She slams the door in his face and he says, I'm going to count down from 10. She starts the countdown because she's like, I will kill you. She starts the countdown from 10. And by the time she makes it to 1, we hear the front door slam open and a man comes barreling through at her through the front door. The same man that tried to come at her in the garden earlier. So Harper runs through the house, slams the bathroom door, and she stands back, and we're watching the bathroom door, and then all of a sudden the door opens, and who do you know? The priest walks right on in, and he too has his hand cut down from the middle of his middle finger and his ring finger all the way down to his forearm. Harper asks, what are you? And his response is, a son. Then the next words out of his mouth are, when did you lose your virginity? What struck me the most is that he is saying that because of you, all of these thoughts now exist in my mind. He says verbatim, this is the power and the control that you exert. After talking about all these graphic details about how he's pictured her. But she ends up stabbing him, and she runs out of the house, is trying to drive off the property and away from this place. And she ends up running over Jeffrey, the Airbnb host, who comes out of nowhere on the road, but she runs him over. Me personally, I would have zoomed over his ass and kept the moving. She hit him going, I'm not even kidding you, 70 miles an hour, 80 miles an hour. This man rolls over and gets up, which lets me know he's of the devil. And he comes up to the car and he calls her Mrs. I can't remember her last name, but he emphasizes the fact that she's supposed to be a wife. And he yanks her by her hair out of the car and slams her down onto the ground, effectively knocking her out, and then proceeds to carjack her. So she stands up. She's like, oh, I'm done for. And we hear that he has turned around and is full speed ahead, driving, trying to run her over. So he ends up crashing into like a pillar that's coming out of the ground. And that man is presumably done for. Harper is motherfucking tired. And you only see the headlights of the car. And here comes Mr. Penis, naked man. We see that like he's in pain and that he can't really walk and that his foot is broken. His stomach is also growing in size. So he falls back, he leans back, and he proceeds to give birth out of his anus. And this is the part that loses a lot of people. This is the part where I feel like even the movie itself kind of loses itself. Harper's just standing there. And this is the point that I noticed that like Harper hasn't spoken in like, I don't know, 20 minutes. Like not a single word has she spoken. So she watches the first man give birth. The second man tries to come out and crawl, and he starts to crawl toward her. When he tries to stand, his foot is broken, so he falls to the ground. He then gets insanely huge. I'm assuming that this is a CGI boy. He proceeds to fall to the ground and give birth to Jeffrey. Jeffrey then tries to, again, take one step and cannot, and proceeds to fall to the ground and gets on all fours and actually gives birth via a vaginal opening on his back. So the birth via the back happens, and Harper actually turns her back and walks away and goes into the living room and gets an axe. And as that's happening, she makes eye contact with the last one who is about to give birth to the last man, and he says please. And as he says please, you see his belly getting big, and he actually proceeds to give birth via his mouth, but the person is breached, so they're coming out foot first through his mouth, which was very graphic. But you see a broken foot and a regular foot coming out, and then the person falls out of frame of the camera, so we don't really see that happening. But Harper has her back turned. She has the axe in her hand, and she turns around to see none other than her husband James limping into the room with his hand split from here all the way down and a broken foot. So James, covered in blood and with all of his ailments, limps over to the couch, and Harper sits down next to him. So James tells Harper to look at him, and he names off all his ailments that happened to him, like collapsed lungs, internal bleeding, and he says, quote, "This is what you did." The gaslighting never stops. Harper asks, after all of this, "What do you want from me?" And he looks at her and he says, "All I want is your love." And then the movie's over. I know, y'all, this is a fever dream. Let's break this down. This movie scared me in a very visceral way, in a way that I have never been scared at a horror movie before. It was to the point where I could have walked out of the theater at one point. Like, if the tension didn't subside, I could have walked out of the theater. And in reflection, I feel like I felt that deeply about it because, unfortunately, it is a feeling that most women will experience in their life, is the feeling of being trapped by men, of feeling like we don't really have options, that we don't want to be impolite in situations, that we shouldn't speak up for ourselves when we know damn fucking well that we should, but we've been socialized to believe that we can't. Just the internal dialogue and panic that happens when you're in seemingly low stakes situations was so visceral for me that it almost was too much for me to handle at some points in the movie. The acting was phenomenal, in my opinion. There was never a point in which I didn't believe the people on the screen, to the point that I did not put together that the actor that was playing one of the men was playing all of the men in the movie. I also enjoyed Harper's performance a lot. Like, I really believed her. Like, I really saw the anguish that she was going through in standing her ground and like knowing that it wasn't her fault, but then like still trying to battle, having that internal battle of it, like, is it my fault? Is this something that I've done? It was just phenomenally done in so many different ways. What I found also very interesting is that the film is called simply Men, as if that word is enough to cause and evoke horror out of you. Like, it didn't need to be titled anything else. That is fascinating. Just existing as a woman around men can be terrifying for a lot of different women. So let's talk about whether or not this movie was effective. I feel like the movie did lose itself in the end. And even when Alex, the director slash writer of this movie, was asked about it, he won't really give a straight answer as to what it's about. He definitely wants the film to be open to interpretation, which I think is a choice, sure. But unlike, if you're like a Jordan Peele fan, unlike, you know, Us and Get Out, where there are pretty clear ideas of like where you're kind of supposed to go, and then there's like kind of fan theories and like Easter eggs and like, you know, like fun discourse around like double meanings and metaphors. This was way too open to interpretation to lean on dialogue like that, really like finishing out the conversation. It was like they just put this like mess of an ending on it and then was like, okay, open to interpretation. And I do feel like it ended up losing itself because it had such a strong beginning, in that you kind of put together by the end that all of this is just showing the way that misogyny and toxic masculinity is passed down from generation to generation to generation, and how it shows itself in society in both the blatant ways and the very undercover, skin crawly ways as well, where you can't really put your finger on it and name it harassment or sexism, but it's there and you know it's there. Is it misogynistic in and of itself for a man, Alex Garland, to be explaining what toxic masculinity and misogyny is in our society? Is that in and of itself misogynistic? Like, who did we write this for? Because I find that this happens too when people are trying to have discourse around films concerning Black people. I'm gonna speak as a Black person because you know I'm Black. It seems like sometimes that people make movies discussing issues of race in our society, not from the vantage point of a Black person going through it, and we're just showing and depicting that, but more so it's like the actors in the movie are trying to explain why racism is bad, and that to me is a clear indicator of the audience that you're trying to get at. Misogyny and toxic masculinity are bad things, but it's like, did a man need to mansplain it? But then also, he didn't really mansplain it. He didn't explain it. But I did think that it was pretty interesting that instead of it coming from a woman's point of view, we had it coming from a cis white man's perspective. If who do you want your audience to be? Because if you want it to be the same men that you're talking about, because if I'm thinking about it again from the perspective of a film being made about racism, the target audience for that is white people, right? So that they can see their behavior supposedly being modeled and teach them to do differently. If this film is in the same way for men to see their toxic masculine and misogynistic ways being modeled on screen so that they can change it and do better, I don't know how effective that would be with a last scene as the one that you had, where men are literally giving birth through their anuses and giving birth through their backs and giving birth through their mouths. Like, it was a very, very graphically depicted scene. So if you want a man to watch that, I just don't see it happening. Like, my nephew was there and he like kind of checked out during that part because it was just overload. Like, most men don't even watch their kids being pushed out. And you wanted us to not only watch someone give birth, but a man giving birth. If this was your intention and you wanted for these men to connect with these misogynistic characters and potentially see themselves in these characters in order to call themselves out and do better, was this the way to do it? I feel like the question that's most often asked about a movie is like, was it good? And that is something that people have asked me when I bring up this movie in my actual life. And it's hard to say. I feel like a film like this doesn't necessarily fit into the binaries of good and bad. This movie was kind of on like its own scale all by itself. Would I recommend this movie to people? Possibly. I recommend it to the people that I think can receive the message, because it's kind of easy to get lost in this movie because it explains literally nothing. Like, if you go into this movie thinking that it's going to be a mindless watch, it absolutely is not. And if you don't put some thought into it, you will feel like you just wasted the past hour and 30 minutes of your life. I'm not gonna lie to you. But it was extremely thought-provoking. It made me really examine myself, my womanhood, what it means to be a woman, what it means also to be a man, and the box that can feel so limiting to a lot of men. Please go in very mentally prepared. Please go in with open thoughts, open minds, and I think you'd enjoy it. And if you have seen Men, please comment down in the comment section down below and tell me what your opinions were on it, because I don't think I hate men. I don't think I hate men. But you know, I could hate men. I don't hate men. And with all that being said, thank you guys so much for coming to another video. I hope you guys enjoyed this first installment of Simone Watches. If you guys would like me to continue these videos, please drop some suggestions as to what you would like me to watch down below. And we'll get into it. And that is all that I have for you guys today. Remember to keep positivity in your life, because positivity breeds positivity, and we have absolutely no time for negativity in 2022. I'll see you guys super duper soon in my next video. Mwah! Bye, guys.